Onward!
The Crimea, 1854, the Battle of Balaclava, famous for the catastrophic charge of the Light Brigade. But what if I told you that we should remember that day for much more? Do you know of the Thin Red Line? 500 Highlanders standing between the Russian cavalry and the collapse of Britain's entire Crimean campaign. No squares, no trenches. Just one very thin red line of Scots in kilts with nerves of iron, balls of steel. Outnumbered, exposed and armed with a new rifle barely tested in combat. Can they hold? Or will this be the day Britain's redcoats are finally trampled into the mud? This is the story of perhaps the bravest stand in British military history. It's also the story of how technology changed the rules of war overnight and helped to shape the tactics of the modern battlefield. My name's Chris, and if you love British military history and incredible tales of daring do, then welcome to Redcoat History. This is the channel for you, my friend. In the autumn of 1854, the British Army found itself camped on the Crimean Peninsula, staring down at one of the most powerful fortresses in the Russian Empire, Sevastopol. The war had begun the year before when a tangled mess of diplomacy, religious disputes and imperial chest-thumping escalated into full-blown conflict between Russia on one side and the Ottoman Empire, France and Britain on the other. Britain's war aim was simple enough: cripple Russian naval power in the Black Sea, and for that Sevastopol had to fall. To achieve it, Allied forces landed on Crimea's western coast and fought their way south, winning a costly but decisive victory at the Battle of Alma in September. From there they marched towards Sevastopol and began a long bloody siege. But as geeks like you guys will know, no siege, in fact no war, can last without supplies and logistics. And that's where Balaclava came in. A sleepy port on the southern coast, Balaclava was the British lifeline, the vital link through which food, ammo and reinforcements flowed to the trenches outside Sevastopol. Lose that and the entire operation would collapse. The terrain around Balaclava wasn't ideal. It was sat in a bowl with ridges and hills all around. The causeway heights to the north formed a natural approach, and the British, short on men as ever, entrusted much of their outer defence to their Ottoman allies. A series of redoubts, basic hilltop fortifications, were built along the heights, each manned by a handful of Turkish troops with a few naval guns to bolster them. In theory it was a decent plan. In practice it was held together by a thread. By late October the Russians saw their chance. Under General Pavel Liprandi they assembled a sizable force of over 25,000 men, including a large force of cavalry and over 70 guns. With this sizable force they launched their attack. Their goal: seize the heights, drive through to Balaclava and cut off the British Army's only supply route. To be fair, it was a pretty good plan. The attack began in the early hours of the 25th of October 1854, and it didn't take long for things to go wrong for the Allies. Redoubt number 1 at the tip of the causeway heights was hit first. Despite brave resistance, the Ottoman defenders were overwhelmed. With no reserves and little coordination, the defenders of the remaining redoubts panicked and abandoned their positions. One after the other, the entire line of redoubts fell. Suddenly, the Russian army had punched a hole straight through the Allied flank. It wasn't looking good. From his nearby vantage point, Lord Raglan, commander of the British forces, watched in growing horror as the line collapsed. He immediately called for reinforcements from the main camp near Sevastopol, but they were miles away and would take hours to arrive. Which meant that the road to Balaclava now lay wide open. The only thing standing between the Russian cavalry and the British supply base were a few thousand cavalry, both the Heavy Brigade and the Light Brigade, and just one battalion of infantry, the 93rd Regiment of Foot even, aka the Sutherland Highlanders. They numbered around 500 to 550 men. Alongside them were a handful of troops from other regiments, and about 100 convalescents quickly rustled up from the area. They'd been tasked with holding the quiet southern flank of the Allied line. Now they found themselves the last defence between the Russian army and the collapse of the entire Crimean campaign. Behind them lay the port, wagons, supplies, wounded men, horses, that sort of thing. You get the picture. What happened next though has gone down in legend, but at the time it looked like utter madness. A British general, 500 Highlanders and several hundred Russian cavalry heading straight for them. Now, any other commander, your average desk-bound general or social climbing aristocrat, would have played it safe, ordered the men into square formation, the classic defence against cavalry, 4 deep, all sides protected, textbook stuff. But Sir Colin Campbell, commander of the Highland Brigade, wasn't having any of it. Campbell was no desk walloper. He'd been fighting wars since the age of 16. The Peninsular War, India, China, he'd seen it all. Tough as old boots, cool under pressure, and famously blunt. He was a Scot through and through. The 93rd Sutherland Highlanders were his last line of defence for Balaclava. He'd posted them just outside the village of Kadikoy, a slight rise giving them a bit of elevation. From there they could see the entire valley spread before them and the advancing Russian cavalry coming over the ridge. Now, the 93rd weren't hardened veterans as such. They'd fought at Alma, but before that they'd been on home service since the 1840s. Many of them were recent recruits and some were recovering from illness or wounds, that sort of thing. But needs must when the Russians come calling. As the thunder of hooves echoed across the plain, Campbell made his decision. He refused to form square. We mentioned what a square was, but the downside of it is it's vulnerable to artillery fire and it can't bring all of its firepower to bear against the enemy at once, obviously because of the shape. So instead, he ordered the Highlanders into line, just 2 ranks deep, spread across the field like a scarlet ribbon, barely a few hundred metres from the Russian cavalry who were gathering speed with every second. It was a ballsy decision. His reasoning, well, simple. He wanted every musket in the regiment facing forward. He was betting that with proper discipline, accurate fire and a bit of Highland grit, the 93rd could stop a cavalry charge in its tracks. It was frankly unthinkable, surely impossible, right? A thin red line of scarlet tunics and tall bonnets, barely 500 men against a similar number of galloping sabres and lances. But Campbell wasn't done. He rode along the front of the line, and as he passed in front of the men, he gave one of the most spine-tingling orders in British military history. "There's no retreat from here, men. You must die where you stand." Imagine being in that line. The Russians are closing in. You've perhaps never fired your mini rifled musket in anger. You're covered in sweat, your mouth's dry, and your general, cool as anything, is telling you, no fallback lads, no second chance. Just hold or die. Now at this moment, a voice calls out from the ranks, a single stoic response, cracking through the tension like a drum beat. "Aye, aye, Sir Colin, and if needs be, we'll do that." I'm not going to do a Scottish accent. The man was Private John Scott, great name, a ranker, an everyman. But his reply said everything you needed to know about the 93rd and their morale. No bluster, no fuss, just grim determination. Now, for those wondering, the line wasn't completely alone. There were some guardsmen in the vicinity, and on either flank were a few scattered Ottoman soldiers, survivors from the earlier rout at the redoubts. But they were shattered, exhausted, and frankly terrified. As the Russians closed in, they fired a hasty, ragged volley and then bolted to the rear. In a way, you can't blame them. They'd already been defeated that day. That left the Highlanders basically alone, a single battalion, one thin red line of bayonets and nerves of iron. And across the field, the Russian cavalry were forming up, sabres drawn, lances upright, dozens of horsemen in front, hundreds more behind. Now, the question was, could Campbell's gamble actually work? Could a thin red line of infantry in the open hold their ground against a full-blooded cavalry charge? Now, anyone who follows my Peninsular War films will know that infantry could rarely hold a line against a charging force of cavalry, but battlefield technology had recently begun to evolve, and the Highlanders were armed with recently issued pattern 1851 mini-rifled muskets, a weapon far superior to the trusty old smoothbore Brown Bess, which had been carried for decades, if not centuries. Now, if you love the history of firearms, then stick with this video because later on we're going to take a closer look at this weapon and the impact it made on the face of warfare, not just then, but even now.
Cover with us, boys! Forward!
Over 400 cavalrymen, hussars, dragoons, Cossacks, all the lot, steam down from the causeway heights with sabres flashing and lances poised. Dust rises behind them, the thunder of hooves pounding across the open steppe like distant gunfire. Standing there, the 500 men, 2 ranks deep, no cover, no reserves. A few of the redcoats even stepped forward as if ready to charge the cavalry. Got to respect that. Campbell's voice rang out again. 93rd, damn all that eagerness. He was a pro and wasn't about to let his line unravel. He was already taking a gamble. The Russian cavalry advanced line abreast, 30 or 40 riders wide. It wasn't a full-scale breakneck charge, but it didn't need to be. From the hill where famous newspaperman William Howard Russell watched, it looked like the end. He later wrote he could see nothing between the charging Russians and the British regiment's base of operation at Balaclava but the, quote, thin red streaked tip with a line of steel. In his later accounts he changed the phrase to the simpler thin red line. The cavalry weren't charging blind. They could see the Highlanders, those tall black bonnets, those red jackets. Campbell had deliberately positioned them on a slight rise so they'd be visible. So the Russians would know there was a line of redcoats blocking their path. It wasn't going to be easy. The gamble was psychological as much as tactical. And then the moment of impact drew near. Sir Colin Campbell, calm as ever, raised his sword. "Hold your fire, men. Hold, hold." Every hand clenched tighter on their Pattern 1851 mini rifle, the most advanced weapon many of these men had ever seen. A rifled barrel, a conical bullet that spun through the air with devastating accuracy. This thing could kill at 600 yards, maybe more, in the hands of a trained shot. Now I know everyone in the comments will go nuts, say, "Oh no it couldn't, oh yes it could shoot at a mile," but anyway, let's crack on. Now, as Brett Gibbons says in his excellent book, The Destroying Angel, which was my motivation to make this film, the rifled musket forever changed the status of the soldier, transforming him from an expendable automaton into a skilled, educated artisan. I like that. The Russians are now within 600 yards. Campbell gives the order. Crack! A volley of controlled, disciplined fire tears out across the valley. The smoke from black powder billows like a sudden fog. Russians fall, horses rearing, bodies crumpling. The charge falters, not stopped, but checked. They're stunned by the sheer distance at which they're being peppered with bullets. How is this possible? Now, I found it hard to nail down exactly how many volleys the 93rd fire at this point. Was it 1 or 2? Let me know in the comments if you're certain, as I've found different sources aren't totally clear on this and I'd love to be certain. Either way, the Russians regroup, wheeling to the Highlanders' exposed right flank, where the Ottoman troops had already broken. If they can turn the flank, roll up the entire line from the side, it might all fall apart. But again, Campbell's ready. He wheels the 93rd Grenadier Company to face the new threat. They pivot like clockwork, and when the cavalry came again, another crashing blast of musketry. The mini bullets smash through saddles and tear through flesh, dropping riders and horses alike. Unsurprisingly, the Russians break. In less than 5 minutes, Balaclava, the entire Crimea campaign, is saved. The horsemen turn and gallop back towards the heights where they came from. The Highlanders cheer, and who can blame them? Now, right there in that moment, something fundamental changed. Not just the outcome of a battle, but the shape of warfare. For centuries, cavalry had ruled the battlefield. Shock troops, sabres, speed. Infantry either ran or formed square and prayed, hoped for the best. But here, 500 redcoats, 2 ranks deep, firing well-aimed volleys with rifles, held the field. And the cavalry ran. The thin red line had stood. As Gibbons says again in his book, a paradigm shift in battlefield tactics occurred. Ordinary British rifle-armed infantry had cut down a Russian cavalry charge and silenced Russian artillery at the Battle of Balaclava. It's ironic that this date and the battle itself is far better known for Lord Cardigan's disastrous charge of the Light Brigade at the very end of the engagement. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Charge of the Light Brigade ensured that Balaclava would forever be associated with someone's blunder. After the fight, Campbell, eyes glistening, rode up to the men and said, "Well done, my children." The 93rd was awarded the Battle Honour Balaclava, the only infantry unit to receive it. Their action was immortalised in painting, like this one, Robert Gibbs' The Thin Red Line, and in poetry and in regimental pride. Even Rudyard Kipling later wrote about the thin red line of heroes. Now, I'd like to do more on the Crimean War in the future. It's a campaign that I'm only just beginning to study. So let me know in the comments if you want more and what angles you'd like me to focus on. You should also be aware that the Victorian Military Society is holding their annual conference soon. The theme? Yep, you guessed it, the Crimean War, 1854 to 56. It will be at the London Army Museum, and you can find out more by visiting victorianmilitary.org. I'm involved with them, and they're a brilliant set of historians determined, like me, to keep the history of our great nation alive. Anyway, in the meantime, I think you're going to enjoy the video that's on screen now. I'll see you next week.